The morning of October 15th arrived in General Santos City with an unusual heaviness in the air. Manny Pacquiao stood on the balcony of his training facility, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The familiar sounds of the city awakening filled his ears, but something felt different today. The rhythmic noise of jeepneys and tricycles seemed muted, as if the entire country was holding its breath. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, calls from promoters, family members, and media outlets flooding in with the same devastating news. The Mayon volcano, the pride of the Philippines, and a symbol of natural beauty that had stood majestically for centuries, had suffered a catastrophic landslide during the night. The perfect cone that had inspired poets, artists, and dreamers across generations was gone forever, its iconic silhouette permanently altered by nature's unexpected fury. Manny's weathered hands gripped the railing as he processed the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just the loss of a landmark, it was the destruction of something deeply embedded in the Filipino soul. Mayon had been featured on their currency, in their literature, in countless photographs that families sent to relatives working overseas. It represented the Philippines to the world, and now it lay broken, its perfect symmetry reduced to rubble and painful memories. The champion boxer who had faced the fiercest opponents in the ring felt his knees weaken as images from news reports flashed through his mind. Entire communities near the volcano had been forced to evacuate during the night. Families who had lived in the shadow of Mayon for generations were now homeless, their ancestral lands buried under tons of volcanic debris. The agricultural fields that had fed thousands were destroyed, covered in a grey blanket of ash and stone. Inside the facility, his longtime trainer Buboy Fernandez sat silently watching the news coverage on multiple screens. The man who had witnessed Manny's greatest victories now watched his fighter process a different kind of defeat, one that no amount of training or determination could overcome. Around them, young boxers who usually filled the gym with energy and determination sat in stunned silence, their dreams of following in Pacquiao's footsteps temporarily forgotten in the face of this national tragedy. Manny thought about his mother Dionysia back in Kibawe, Bukidnon, and how she had always spoken about Mayon with reverence during his childhood. She would describe its perfect cone shape as a reminder that even in an imperfect world, beauty and harmony could exist. As a young boy selling cigarettes on the streets, he had dreamed of one day visiting the volcano, of standing before its majesty as a successful man who had lifted himself from poverty. The weight of representing his country had never felt heavier. Throughout his career, Manny had carried the hopes and dreams of millions of Filipinos into every ring. When he fought, vendors would close their stalls, students would crowd around radios, and entire barangays would gather to watch their champion. Now, as reports continued to pour in about the extent of the damage, he felt the collective grief of his people settling into his chest like a physical burden. Social media was already flooded with tributes to the lost landmark. Artists were sharing their paintings of Mayon's former glory, while writers posted poems about its symbolic meaning to Filipino identity. International news outlets were covering the story, but Manny knew that outsiders could never truly understand what this loss meant to his countrymen. As the morning progressed, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just about a natural disaster. This was about the destruction of a piece of the Filipino spirit, and Manny Pacquiao, the man who had spent his life fighting for his country's honor, now faced his greatest challenge, helping his people heal from a wound that no victory in any boxing ring could ever remedy. The news cameras had begun arriving at Manny's training facility by mid-morning, their satellite trucks lined up along the narrow street like mechanical vultures waiting to capture his reaction to the national tragedy. Through the tinted windows of his office, he watched reporters adjusting their equipment and practicing their opening lines, preparing to broadcast his response to a world that suddenly seemed much smaller and more fragile. His assistant Teodora had been fielding calls all morning, her usually composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of coordinating interviews while maintaining some semblance of normalcy. Government officials wanted statements, charitable organizations sought endorsements, and international media outlets demanded exclusive access to the champion's thoughts on this unprecedented disaster that had shaken the very foundation of Filipino identity. Manny found himself pacing the length of his office, his bare feet silent against the polished concrete floor. On his desk, lay printouts of damage assessments that painted a grim picture of the affected areas. Thousands of families had lost everything overnight. Agricultural communities that had thrived for generations were now barren wastelands. Schools, hospitals, and churches that had served as cornerstones of local communities were buried under volcanic debris that would take years to clear. The financial implications were staggering, but what troubled Manny most was the psychological impact on his countrymen. He had seen the look in people's eyes after devastating typhoons, the hollow stare of those who had lost hope. But this felt different. Mayon had been eternal, unchanging, a constant in a world full of uncertainty. Its destruction represented something deeper than material loss. It was the shattering of a collective belief in permanence and stability. His wife, Jinky, had called twice from their home in Manila, her voice heavy with concern for both the victims and her husband's obvious distress. She understood better than anyone how deeply Manny felt the pain of his people, how their suffering became his own burden to carry. Their children Jimuel, Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth, and Israel had all sent messages of support, each expressing their desire to help in whatever way possible. Outside, the training session had been cancelled indefinitely. Young fighters like Benedicto and Armando sat on the steps of the facility, their usual enthusiasm replaced by a somber reflection on the fragility of life and dreams. These aspiring boxers, many from impoverished backgrounds similar to Manny's own, looked to their mentor not just for technical guidance, but for wisdom on how to navigate moments when the world seemed to crumble around them. The economic ramifications were already becoming apparent. Tourism to the Bicol region, which had heavily relied on Mayon's natural beauty, would plummet. Local businesses that had thrived on visitors coming to witness the perfect volcano would struggle to survive. Farming communities that had depended on the fertile volcanic soil would need to rebuild their entire way of life from scratch. Manny remembered his first professional fight, how nervous he had felt stepping into that ring in Manila. The pressure had been immense, but it was nothing compared to what he felt now. Then, failure meant personal disappointment and perhaps a return to poverty. Now an entire nation looked to him for leadership and hope during their darkest hour. His promotional team had already begun discussing the cancellation of upcoming fights and training camps. The idea of engaging in sport while his country mourned felt inappropriate, almost disrespectful to those who had lost everything. Yet Manny also understood that his fights had always served as a source of national pride and temporary escape from hardship. As afternoon approached, Manny made a decision that would define not just his immediate future, but his legacy as more than just a champion boxer. The realization struck him with the force of a knockout punch. This was his moment to prove that true greatness extended far beyond any boxing ring, that a real champion fought not just for personal glory, but for the healing and restoration of his people's broken spirits. By 3 in the afternoon, Manny had dismissed his entire media team and cleared his schedule for the remainder of the week. The decision had crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. He would travel personally to the affected areas around Mayon, not as a celebrity making a photo opportunity, but as a fellow Filipino who understood what it meant to lose everything and rebuild from nothing. His security chief Hilario had initially resisted the plan, citing safety concerns and the ongoing geological instability in the region. The roads leading to the evacuation centers were damaged, communication networks were sporadic, and the risk of aftershocks remained high, but Manny's determination was unwavering. The same steel resolve that had carried him through 8 weight divisions and countless championship fights. The logistics team, led by his longtime associate Doroteo, worked frantically to coordinate the relief mission. Trucks were loaded with essential supplies, rice, canned goods, bottled water, medical supplies, and temporary shelter materials. Manny had emptied 3 of his bank accounts to fund the immediate response, refusing to wait for official channels or charitable organizations to mobilize their slower bureaucratic processes. News of his planned visit spread rapidly through social media and local news networks. In evacuation centers across the Bicol region, displaced families who had been consumed by grief and uncertainty suddenly felt a spark of hope. Children who had been crying for their lost homes began asking their parents when the champion would arrive, as if his presence alone could somehow restore what the volcano had taken away. The convoy that departed from General Santos City consisted of 12 vehicles loaded with supplies and a small medical team that included Dr. Florencio, a respected physician who had volunteered his services. Manny rode in the lead vehicle, his mind focused not on the cameras that would inevitably follow, but on the faces of the people he had seen in the news reports: elderly farmers who had lost ancestral lands, mothers clutching children who no longer had schools to attend, fathers who stared at the rubble where their livelihoods once stood. As they traveled north through Mindanao and into the Visayas, Manny reflected on his own childhood experiences with loss and displacement. He remembered the nights when his family had no food, when they had been forced to move from one cramped dwelling to another, always uncertain about where the next meal would come from. The difference was that his poverty had been a private struggle. These families were facing their devastation in full view of the world. The journey took longer than expected due to damaged infrastructure and emergency checkpoints. At each stop, local officials recognized the convoy and attempted to arrange formal receptions, but Manny instructed his team to politely decline such ceremonies. This was not about public relations or political appearances. It was about human connection during a moment of profound collective trauma. Radio reports during the drive provided constant updates on the continuing crisis. Geologists warned that the structural damage to Mayon was irreversible, that the perfect cone that had defined the Philippine landscape for centuries would never return. Environmental scientists spoke about the long-term impact on local ecosystems, while economists predicted years of recovery for the tourism and agricultural sectors. In evacuation centers throughout the region, families gathered around portable radios and smartphones, tracking Manny's progress toward their location. Children drew pictures of the champion with crayons donated by relief organizations, creating artwork that depicted him not in boxing gloves, but with arms outstretched in embrace. Adults shared stories of watching his fights, how his victories had provided moments of pride and joy during difficult economic times. As evening approached and the convoy neared the first evacuation center, Manny felt the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders. These people didn't need a champion boxer. They needed someone who understood their pain, who could offer not just material assistance, but genuine human compassion. The real fight was about to begin, and this time, the victory would be measured not in knockouts or championship belts, but in restored hope and rebuilt lives. The first evacuation center appeared through the darkness like a beacon of human resilience, its makeshift structures illuminated by generator-powered floodlights that cast long shadows across the muddy ground. Manny stepped out of the convoy vehicle and immediately felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him, faces emerging from temporary shelters to witness the arrival of their national hero during their darkest hour. The center, hastily established in a converted school gymnasium, housed over 300 displaced families. Sleeping mats were arranged in neat rows across the basketball court, where children had once played and laughed. Now, those same children clung to their parents, their usual playfulness replaced by a quiet confusion that broke Manny's heart more than any opponent's punch ever could. An elderly woman named Herminia sat near the entrance, her weathered hands clutching a small photograph of her family's farm that had existed in Mayon's shadow for 4 generations. When she recognized Manny approaching, tears began streaming down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from disbelief that someone of his stature would come to share in their suffering. Her granddaughter Rowena, barely 6 years old, peeked out from behind her grandmother's worn dress, her wide eyes reflecting both curiosity and the trauma of losing everything familiar. The center's coordinator, a dedicated social worker named Pachita, had been working without sleep since the disaster struck. Her clipboard contained lists of immediate needs that seemed to grow longer by the hour: baby formula, medications for elderly evacuees, psychological counseling services for children who woke up screaming from nightmares about falling mountains. She approached Manny with professional composure, but her voice cracked when she began describing the challenges they faced in maintaining basic human dignity for so many displaced people. Throughout the gymnasium, families had created small spaces that represented their attempts to maintain some semblance of home. A father named Celestino had arranged his family's few salvaged possessions into a neat square, creating invisible walls around their sleeping area. His wife, Araceli, tended to their twin boys, Gregorio and Urbano, who had not spoken since witnessing their house disappear under the landslide. The silence of traumatized children filled the space more powerfully than any crying could have. Manny moved methodically through the center, stopping at each family unit to offer what comfort he could through his presence alone. An elderly man named Teofilo showed him a small wooden cross that had belonged to his grandfather, the only item he had managed to save when the evacuation orders came. His daughter Felisa translated his whispered words of gratitude, explaining how watching Manny's fights on television had been one of her father's greatest joys, providing hope during years of struggle with poverty and agricultural hardships. Near the center's medical station, Dr. Basilio worked tirelessly to treat evacuees suffering from respiratory problems caused by volcanic ash inhalation. His supplies were dangerously low, and the nearest hospital was hours away on damaged roads. Elderly patients like Saturnina and Honorata required medications that simply weren't available, forcing difficult decisions about which treatments to prioritize when resources were so limited. The psychological impact was perhaps more devastating than the physical damage. Families who had lived for generations in the protective shadow of Mayan now felt exposed and vulnerable, their sense of place and belonging shattered along with the mountain's perfect silhouette. Community leaders like Marcelo and Bartolome struggled to maintain morale while dealing with their own profound grief over the loss of ancestral lands that had defined their identity for centuries. As Manny continued his quiet pilgrimage through the evacuation center, he began to understand that his role here extended far beyond providing material relief. These people needed to see that they had not been forgotten, that their suffering mattered to someone who represented the best of Filipino achievement and character. The second night at the evacuation center brought no relief from the overwhelming sadness that permeated every corner of the makeshift shelter. Manny had refused the comfortable accommodations offered by local officials, instead choosing to sleep on a thin mat beside the families he had come to support. The concrete floor was unforgiving against his back, but physical discomfort paled in comparison to the emotional weight of witnessing so much human suffering. Around him, the gentle sounds of restless sleep filled the gymnasium. Mothers like Serafina whispered lullabies to children who startled awake from nightmares about rumbling earth and falling rocks. Her infant son cried intermittently throughout the night, his distress reflecting the anxiety that hung over everyone in the shelter like a heavy blanket. Nearby, an elderly farmer named Amado lay awake staring at the ceiling, his weathered hands folded across his chest, as he processed the reality that his family's rice fields would never yield another harvest. Manny found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with memories of his own childhood struggles and the profound responsibility he felt toward these displaced families. He thought about his mother, Dionysia, and how she had always taught him that true strength came not from physical power, but from the ability to lift others during their moments of greatest need. The lessons learned in poverty-stricken Kibawe seemed more relevant now than any boxing technique he had ever mastered. In the dim light filtering through high windows, he watched a young mother named Juliana gently rock her daughter to sleep. The child, no more than 3 years old, clutched a mud-stained doll that had been rescued from the rubble of their destroyed home. This simple toy represented everything precious that had been lost, not just material possessions, but the sense of security and permanence that every child deserved to feel. The medical station remained active throughout the night as Dr. Florencio and his volunteer team treated patients suffering from stress-related ailments. An elderly woman named Visitacion had developed severe anxiety attacks since losing her home, her body shaking uncontrollably as she struggled to comprehend how her familiar world had disappeared in a single night. Her grandson, Wilfredo, sat beside her bed, holding her trembling hand while fighting back his own tears of helplessness. Volunteers like Rosalinda and Marilu worked tirelessly to maintain basic sanitation and food distribution, their own exhaustion evident in every movement. They had been working around the clock since the disaster struck, driven by a sense of duty to their displaced neighbors that transcended personal fatigue. Their quiet dedication reminded Manny of the countless unsung heroes who made sacrifice and service their daily practice without seeking recognition or reward. The children affected Manny most deeply. A boy named Vicente, perhaps 8 years old, sat alone drawing pictures with donated crayons. His artwork depicted not the happy scenes typical of childhood creativity, but dark mountains and fleeing families. His sister Minerva watched over him protectively, her premature maturity heartbreaking to witness. These children had lost not just their homes, but their innocence and sense of safety in the world. As dawn approached, Manny noticed a small group of teenagers, including Emmanuel and Isidro, sitting together near the entrance, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief and uncertainty about their futures. Their schools had been destroyed, their communities scattered, and their dreams of education and careers suddenly seemed impossibly distant. The volcanic ash that covered everything served as a constant reminder that their old lives had been buried, along with Mayon's perfect cone. The morning brought fresh challenges as supplies ran low and tensions began to rise among evacuees facing an uncertain future. Families like those headed by Melchior and Guillermo struggled to maintain hope, while government officials offered only vague promises about long-term assistance and resettlement programs that might take years to implement. The third morning at the evacuation center marked a turning point in both the crisis and Manny's understanding of his role beyond the boxing ring. As he walked through the rows of displaced families, he began formulating a comprehensive plan that would extend far beyond emergency relief. The scope of devastation demanded a response equal to the magnitude of loss, and he realized that his influence could mobilize resources on a national scale. His first call was to business leaders across the Philippines, many of whom had supported his boxing career through sponsorships and endorsements. Within hours, a network of corporate executives, including prominent figures like Bayani from the telecommunications industry and Isagani from agricultural exports, had committed substantial resources to long-term recovery efforts. Their immediate response demonstrated how deeply the Mayon tragedy had affected the national psyche. The media attention surrounding Manny's presence had drawn international coverage, bringing global awareness to the disaster that might otherwise have been overshadowed by larger world events. News crews from neighboring countries arrived to document not just the destruction, but the remarkable unity displayed by Filipino communities in the face of unimaginable loss. Camera operators like Jericho and sound technicians like Emil worked respectfully around the evacuees, ensuring that their dignity remained intact while sharing their stories with the world. Local government officials, initially overwhelmed by the crisis, began coordinating with Manny's expanded relief operation. Mayor Enrico from a nearby municipality arrived with additional medical supplies and construction equipment, while Congresswoman Thomas brought news of emergency legislation that would fast-track recovery funding. The political machinery that often moved slowly was suddenly operating with unprecedented urgency and efficiency. The psychological support services expanded as word spread about the mental health crisis developing among evacuees. Trained counselors like Dr. Ariel and therapist Carlo established programs specifically designed for children experiencing trauma. Their work with young victims like the brothers Joaquin and Andres, who had witnessed their grandfather's workshop disappear under volcanic debris, provided crucial intervention during the most vulnerable period of their recovery. Religious leaders from various denominations arrived to offer spiritual comfort to families struggling with questions about faith and divine purpose. Father Edgardo conducted interfaith services that brought together Catholics, Protestants, and members of indigenous spiritual traditions, creating moments of unity that transcended denominational differences. His gentle approach helped families like that of Miguel and Roberto process their grief within their cultural and spiritual frameworks. Educational specialists recognized the urgent need to address disrupted schooling for hundreds of children. Volunteer teachers, including Noel and Leonardo, established temporary classrooms using donated tablets and solar charging stations. Their makeshift school served children like Dante's daughter and Inigo's son, ensuring that education continued even in the midst of displacement and uncertainty. The agricultural recovery posed the most complex long-term challenge. Experts like Jaime, a soil scientist, and Ernesto, a crop specialist, conducted assessments of the damaged farmland. Their preliminary reports indicated that some areas might be suitable for cultivation within 2 years, while others would require extensive soil rehabilitation or complete agricultural transformation. Farming families led by patriarchs like Elmer and Reuben faced decisions about whether to rebuild their traditional livelihoods or pursue entirely new forms of economic activity. International humanitarian organizations began arriving with specialized equipment and expertise. Representatives from disaster relief agencies worked alongside local coordinators like Rogelio and Alfredo to establish more permanent housing solutions. Their modular shelter systems would provide evacuee families with privacy and dignity, while long-term reconstruction plans were developed and implemented. The media coverage had also attracted attention from overseas Filipino worker communities who began organizing remittance drives to support recovery efforts. Workers in the Middle East, nurses in the United States, and seafarers worldwide contributed portions of their hard-earned wages to help their countrymen rebuild. This global Filipino diaspora response demonstrated the deep connections that transcended geographical boundaries and economic circumstances. As evening approached, Manny stood before the expanded relief operation that had grown from his simple decision to personally witness the suffering of his people. The transformation from individual gesture to national movement reflected the Filipino spirit of bayanihan that emerged strongest during times of greatest need. A week had passed since Manny first arrived at the evacuation center, and the transformation was remarkable, not just in the physical improvements to the shelter, but in the renewed spirit of the displaced families. The gymnasium that had once echoed with despair now buzzed with purposeful activity as various relief programs took shape under his coordinated leadership. The temporary school established by volunteer educators had become a beacon of normalcy for the children. Young students like Julian and Arturo attended daily classes alongside their peers, their laughter during recess providing a soundtrack of resilience that lifted the spirits of their traumatized parents. Teacher Hernando had developed innovative lesson plans that helped children process their experiences through art and storytelling, while educator Orlando focused on maintaining academic progress despite the disrupted circumstances. Medical services had expanded significantly with the arrival of specialized practitioners. Dr. Pacquiao, a pediatric specialist, worked with children exhibiting signs of post-traumatic stress, while therapist Eliaza provided family counseling services for households struggling to maintain unity under extreme pressure. Their combined efforts had already shown positive results in families like those led by Alonzo and Celso, where initial tensions had given way to stronger bonds forged through shared adversity. The agricultural rehabilitation project had gained momentum as more experts joined the assessment teams. Soil specialist Eduardo and irrigation engineer Silvestre worked alongside local farmers to develop innovative approaches to land recovery. Their preliminary studies suggested that with proper treatment, portions of the affected farmland could be restored within 18 months, rather than the initially projected 3 years. International support continued to pour in from unexpected sources. A delegation of Japanese disaster recovery experts, led by specialists Filemon and Narciso, who had Filipino heritage, arrived with advanced equipment for geological surveys. Their experience with volcanic disasters provided valuable insights for long-term planning and safety protocols that would protect future generations from similar catastrophes. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims, affecting entire communities throughout the Philippines who felt connected to Mayon's cultural significance. Poets like Gaudencio and artists like Emmanuel created works that captured the national grief while celebrating the resilience demonstrated by survivors. Their creative expressions provided outlets for collective mourning and healing that transcended individual trauma. Corporate partnerships had materialized into concrete assistance programs. Construction company owner Siriaco committed to building permanent housing at Costi, while transportation magnate Cornelio provided free logistics support for ongoing relief operations. Technology entrepreneur Eugenio donated communication equipment that reconnected scattered families and enabled evacuees to contact overseas relatives who had been desperately seeking news. The religious community's response demonstrated the deep spiritual bonds that united Filipinos across denominational lines. Ministers like Manolo and priests like Alejandro worked together to provide comfort, while respecting the diverse beliefs represented among the evacuees. Their joint services became powerful symbols of unity that transcended theological differences. Educational initiatives expanded beyond basic schooling to include vocational training programs designed to help adults transition to new livelihoods. Instructors like Severino taught construction skills, while Mateo provided training in modern agricultural techniques. These programs recognized that recovery meant not just rebuilding what was lost, but creating opportunities for economic advancement. The media coverage had evolved from crisis reporting to documentation of remarkable human resilience. Journalists like Segundo and photographers like Tadeo captured stories of individual triumph that inspired audiences worldwide. Their work ensured that the Mayon disaster would be remembered not just for its destruction, but for the extraordinary response it generated. As Manny prepared for his eventual return to General Santos City, he reflected on how this experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of his role as a public figure. The boxing championships that had defined his career suddenly seemed like preparation for this moment, when his true championship would be measured by his ability to help rebuild not just structures, but hope itself. The evacuation center had become a symbol of Filipino resilience, proving that even the most devastating natural disasters could not break the spirit of a people united in their determination to rise from tragedy stronger than before. 2 months after the Mayon disaster, Manny stood once again on the balcony of his training facility in General Santos City, but the man who gazed out at the familiar skyline was fundamentally different from the one who had first learned of the tragedy. The sunrise painted the same amber and gold hues across the horizon, yet everything felt transformed by the weight of experience and the depth of human connection he had discovered during those crucial weeks. The evacuation center had been successfully transitioned into permanent housing facilities, with families like those led by Romulo and Mariano now living in dignified accommodations that reflected both modern safety standards and traditional Filipino architectural values. The temporary structures had given way to a planned community that would serve as a model for disaster-resilient development throughout the archipelago. Letters arrived daily from beneficiaries of the relief efforts, handwritten notes from children like those taught by Faustino and Fidel, expressing gratitude that extended far beyond material assistance. These messages, carefully preserved in a special folder, reminded Manny that his greatest victory had not come in any boxing ring, but in the quiet moments of human connection during a time of unprecedented suffering. The agricultural rehabilitation project had exceeded all expectations under the guidance of specialists like Apolinario and Zacharias. Innovative farming techniques developed specifically for volcanic soil had not only restored productivity, but actually increased crop yields beyond pre-disaster levels. Farmers like Panfilo and Leopoldo had become ambassadors for sustainable agriculture, sharing their recovery experiences with communities facing similar challenges throughout Southeast Asia. Educational initiatives had evolved into permanent institutions with the establishment of the Mayon Resilience Academy, where students like those mentored by Catalino and Bonifacio studied disaster preparedness alongside traditional subjects. The curriculum emphasized both practical skills and emotional intelligence, preparing future generations to face challenges with both technical competence and psychological strength. The international attention generated by Manny's response had attracted continued investment in Philippine disaster preparedness infrastructure. Engineers like Teodoro and Saturnino worked on early warning systems that would prevent future tragedies, while researchers like Ambrosio and Crispulo developed building codes specifically adapted to volcanic regions. Medical support systems established during the crisis had become permanent healthcare improvements for rural communities. Doctors like Eusebio and Cipriano maintained clinics that served not just former evacuees, but entire provinces that had previously lacked adequate medical infrastructure. Their work represented a lasting transformation of healthcare accessibility in regions often forgotten by urban-focused development. The psychological healing programs developed during the emergency had grown into comprehensive mental health services throughout the Philippines. Therapists like Gerardo and Aurelio trained local counselors in trauma recovery techniques, creating a network of support that extended far beyond the original disaster zone. As Manny prepared for his next boxing match, he realized that his approach to competition had been forever altered. The championship belts displayed in his trophy room no longer represented his greatest achievements. Instead, his legacy would be measured by the permanent improvements to Filipino disaster resilience and the demonstration that true leadership emerged not from individual glory, but from collective service. The families he had served continued their recovery journeys with dignity and determination. Children like those protected by Lorenzo and Honorato attended schools built to withstand future natural disasters. Adults like Modesto and Rogel worked in jobs created by the economic development initiatives that emerged from the recovery efforts. The perfect cone of Mayon would never return, but in its place had grown something more enduring, a stronger, more resilient Filipino community that proved natural disasters could destroy landscapes, but could never break the human spirit when united in common purpose and compassionate action.